Greetings and welcome to this spooky special Halloween edition of Zilog and Moto. Okay, I'm going to level with you. There was really only like 3 words of that last sentence that are actually true. This is indeed the Halloween edition of Zilog and Moto for 2022, as you can probably tell by the fact that it's being released actually on the day of Halloween. However, there's nothing remotely spooky or special about this episode. It's just me, your host Dave, as we take another look at a game from the English language library of titles for the 8 and 16-bit Sega consoles. Or is there? Nah, I'm just joking. I do what I do every week, pick out one of the games from the shelves behind me, or maybe over there off camera, and give it an in-depth review, complete with a look at its original packaging and in-game footage captured from original hardware when possible. Now that I'm thinking about it, maybe this week is slightly special, as the choice for today's review actually comes via the YouTube comments from Sam P, who asked if I could do a review of this week's game, as it has a bit of a dark theme and it might nicely tie into Halloween. So to you, Sam P, I say, let's do it. This isn't always going to work out because sometimes I've already got certain titles lined up for certain weeks in the schedule, or maybe there's sometimes I want to specifically play a game that particular week, or maybe you're requesting something crazy like Kyo Flying Squadron that I don't own a copy of yet. But if you do have suggestions or requests or just want to discuss that particular video, definitely leave a comment down below. So the choice for today's video is a game called Chakan, sometimes referred to as Chakan the Forever Man, which stars this lovely dual-wielding fellow on the cover here. Now you can see why maybe this was a good choice for a Halloween title. Chakan is a game that I'm very interested in because it's a pretty unique title, and it's one that I've never played before. Now, admittedly, anyone that's watched the channel for any length of time knows that there's lots of games for the review that I haven't played before. But a lot of those games, even if I haven't played them specifically, maybe I've played another version of them, either on a different console or in the arcades. Or they're part of a series, and I'm familiar with the game because I've played another game in the series. Or they're a game where I'm not familiar with the game itself, but it's based on a licensed property. So I at least have some idea of what the game's about because I'm knowledgeable about that licensed intellectual property that the game is based on. Chakan is none of those, sort of. It's unique to Sega platforms with just this version existing for the Genesis, and then an 8-bit port of the title for the Game Gear that was not reported to the Master System, so this is the only version of Chakan that I'll be looking at. And while there was an attempted sequel for the Dreamcast, it never came to fruition, leaving Chakan as a standalone title. Lastly, Chakan is technically a licensed title, but it's based on a license that I had never heard of before, and if you tell me you had heard of it before playing the game, I'm going to call you a liar. Chakan, the character, had apparently appeared previously in a very independent comic book series called Thundermace that was self-published by author and artist Robert Krause from 1986-1990, and the kicker is, Chakan wasn't even part of the main story. He appeared in totally separate 2- and 3-page one-shots at the end of the book. So, am I going to like this game that I know almost entirely nothing about? I have no idea, but let's find out. Okay, this is my copy of Chakan for the Genesis. I don't remember how or when I picked this up, and that's probably going to start happening more often now that the collection dates back 7 years or so. But I'm pretty certain it wasn't too early on, as Chakan isn't a super common title, at least not complete. But it's not super valuable either, currently going for around $40 on price charting, just depending on the condition. As far as this particular copy goes, I would consider this to be in pretty good shape. No hang tab at the top, but at least it was removed cleanly, and the rest of the outer cover is held up well. The inner cover looks fantastic from the front, no edge wear or sun damage, but when you flip over to the back, if you look close, there's a tiny bit of moisture wrinkling, so hard to say if maybe it got wet or was stored in not the driest place in the world. I'm happy with it though, and the manual is in good shape as well, as you'll see in a minute. Now, on to the front cover. This, my friends, is a badass cover. It's Chakan dual-wielding swords, while the cloudy sky behind him looks like it's on fire due to the sun being in the background. And then, just look at the detail. The wide-brimmed hat with a skull in the front, the bandolier across his chest with not just a wooden stake in it, but also what looks like a kunai in there, which you've probably seen if you've played Streets of Rage 2 and gone up against the various ninjas. Looking closer at this, I think you can break down Chakan into 3 inspirations. First, the dual-wielding swords definitely reminds me of early Liefeld era non-goofy Deadpool. And yes, I know Chakan predates Deadpool, I'm specifically referring to this cover art here. Then the body, with the long-sleeve blue shirt and bandolier, appears to be borrowed from Ash of Evil Dead fame. And then finally, the head is a dead ringer for Eddie, the zombie-ish mascot for Iron Maiden. However, it's not too much of any of those 3 and still manages to appear to be a cool character without directly ripping anything or anyone off. Finally, bonus points for that logo. The red and black stylized font with the white outline really pops, especially on that black background. Flipping over the back, and you can see that this is of that second era of Genesis titles where they were no longer trying to lock designers down to a specific formatting or font used. And this is definitely one of the more original rear cover designs I've seen. Note, I didn't say good, just original, as I really would have liked to have seen the screenshots be a bit larger to see some more detail, and the slightly gothic font used looks cool for the center portion, but gets really small and hard to read for the captions. I do like all the flavor text used though, it really serves the game well from a hype perspective, and you see at the top why the game is sometimes referred to as not just Chakan, but Chakan the Forever Man. Opening up the case, and as mentioned, the manual and cartridge are both in good shape. I really like how the manual is written. Some manuals are super dry and just give you the basics about how to play, and that's fine. But this manual is definitely written to give additional color to the game and has not just a nice intro setting up the story of Chakan, but then also some very cool depictions of each of the 4 worlds that you'll be adventuring in as you attempt to complete your quest to allow Chakan to finally be able to escape death and rest. This is a game that I definitely feel like you're missing something if you don't have the manual, and will be harder without, especially with no guidance on the potions. Okay, that's the package. Let's start playing Chakan and see if some of what I've heard about the game is true. Before getting into the actual game, I probably should discuss some of the backstory and set up who Chakan is and what you're doing here. I mentioned earlier that Chakan is a comic book character that was created as technically a filler character. And what I mean by that is the main comic that Chakan appeared in was about the adventures of a totally unrelated character named Thundermace. However, Chakan would appear in many stories after the Thundermace story was finished for the issue, and he would appear to be fighting various dark fantasy villains, like Dracula, werewolves, Frankenstein, or a Minotaur. Eventually, Chakan would get his own one-shot, complete with origin story to explain once and for all who this character was that kept popping up in another character's book. In fact, Chakan was such an independent comic, remember being published by the same guy that was drawing and writing it, that I'm actually pretty amazed that this game got made, as it's a character that I'm not even sure the average comic book fan knew about in 1992. This isn't X-Mutants or Dinosaurs for Hire getting a game due to being a Malibu Comics property and then developed by Malibu Interactive. This is a level of obscurity even beyond that. Video games don't usually get made that are based on a comic book character that starred in one issue of one book. However, independent or no, the story of Chakan is pretty cool and I think fits well from an action video game perspective, especially with its much darker basis than your traditional Marvel or DC superhero story. If you're not familiar with the backstory of Chakan and don't have the manual, don't worry, as the game starts out with a nice intro featuring scrolling text mixed with various art and some intense music. To sum up the game's version of Chakan's story, Chakan was originally a human that got involved with the occult and started to become a powerful warrior as a result. His power grew and he became so confident in his abilities that he thought he could defeat death itself. Well, death, always one for a fight apparently, decided to take Chakan up on this, and Chakan was indeed powerful enough to conquer death. But as you might expect, messing with a literal force of nature like death comes with consequences. Death wasn't one to take defeat lying down, and in turn cursed Chakan to roam the world for an eternity, only being able to rest once all supernatural evil had been eradicated. Which leads us to Chakan the game. Chakan is tasked with conquering the evil that exists in 4 different dimensions, split up as you probably would expect into the fire, earth, water, and air dimensions. The game starts with Chakan being in some sort of ethereal zone that has portals to each of the 4 dimensions arranged around the starting level in the corners. Also, each dimension is split into 2 halves, with each half consisting of 3 levels, and you must complete the first half of each dimension, referred to as the terrestrial planes, before you can circle back and attempt the second half of each dimension, referred to as the elemental planes. This leads to one of the first things that I liked about the game, and that's its somewhat non-linear approach. All of the elemental portals are open from the beginning of the game, so it's up to you to choose which one you want to tackle first. However, much like a game like Mega Man, Chakan has different weapon power-ups to collect in each of the levels, not to mention the 4 different potions for alchemy purposes. And yes, Chakan is using a very loose definition of the term alchemy here, just roll with it. Anyway, the point is, just because you can go through the dimensions in whatever order you choose, you may find that due to needing a different weapon or potion, that it makes more sense for you to collect those first, before attempting to bull your way through a certain level or plane. No matter what path you choose to make your way through the dimensions, the end goal is the same: defeat the bosses in all of them, and then take on a final boss so that death will allow you to finally rest. But then this brings up a quandary that stems from the overall plot of the game. Since Chakan can't die, how does that work for a video game? The designers got around that by introducing a time element to the game. Essentially, Chakan can only spend so long in each dimension, and this time is tracked by an hourglass in-game. If Chakan doesn't complete the 3-level section within that time, then he's booted back out to that ethereal stair zone and must start that section all over again from the beginning. It could be argued then that the biggest enemy in the game isn't actually any of the foes that you'll fight in the level or the bosses, but time itself, which is appropriate for a game with death as a central character. Except, that's absolute rubbish. Sure, the time limit for the zones is something to be aware of, and will definitely keep you on the move as you explore the levels, but it's not your biggest enemy. Truthfully, your biggest enemy in Chakan is all of the little fiends that you run across, that in any other game would be probably just considered a nuisance. Chakan may not be able to die, but he does only have a limited health bar appropriately decorated in skulls. When Chakan loses all his health, which is frequently, he'll get sent back to that ethereal starting area, and he can choose to try again with level and time progress saved in that dimension, or perhaps go visit one of the other 3, assuming that they haven't already been completed. I think this is a great design to go along with the plot of the game. If your character can't officially die, then it makes sense that you would just have to try again. Unfortunately, this is where a game that's great in so many areas just falls flat on its face. Going into the review, the only thing that I knew about Chakan was that people online had referred to it as hard. And boy, were they correct. Chakan has a natural difficulty with the non-linear gameplay and having things not spelled out for the player of what they have to do where. Even if you have the manual, which will tell you what the various alchemical combinations of potions do, nowhere are you told why you should need to use that, say, fire sword or temporal passage, for instance. But these are all things that a game of normal difficulty you could probably figure out and resort to possibly looking up in an FAQ, and they don't really bother me. The problem comes with just the endless amounts of enemies that you're going to face as you try to figure out how to get through the levels, and the fact that apparently Chakan isn't quite as good a swordsman as he thinks he is. As much of a problem as it is that you can take out an enemy and then almost immediately another one will spawn in its place, the fact that Chakan isn't able to reliably take out said enemies is a much larger problem, as you'll end up just taking tons of cheap hits. Oh, and did I mention that all of this was occurring when playing the game in easy mode? Yes, that's right, Chakan features 3 difficulty modes: practice, easy, and hard, and all my attempts to play the game were in easy. Feel free to litter the comments with "get good" and, maybe Chakan is the prototypical Souls type game with the not being able to die aspect, but to me, when I play a game and I choose a difficulty mode to be easy and instead it's an absolutely frustrating slogfest, I tend to have a little bit of a problem with that. I mentioned that I think the game is great in many areas, and it is. I already talked about how I like the non-linear approach that the game has,
and the not being able to die time element to the levels is something that I think is wholly original to Chakan, or at least I can't think of another game on the Genesis that takes a similar approach. But beyond the game design, the graphics and sound in Chakan are fantastic. Chakan and all the enemies are very well detailed, and the sprite work clearly evokes a game that has its inspiration from dark comic books. Similarly, all of the level backgrounds are drawn well, and each dimension, whether you're in the terrestrial or elemental plane, has a radically different look, so there's no mistaking of where you are. There's even some nice parallax scrolling and transparencies thrown in, giving each level that more of an immersive experience as you attempt to make your way through. Also, it should be mentioned that this is all being done with just an 8 megabit cartridge, so it's not like the developers just had endless amounts of storage to fit all this in. The sound, like the graphics, is just as impressive. This is not your average sounding Genesis game. I wouldn't say the soundtrack is my favorite on the console, or even in the top 10 necessarily, but it's pretty damn good. It's probably not anything you would ever want to listen to outside the game, as there's lots of unusual synths being used, and the flow of the music can be quite discordant, but for a dark fantasy / horror style title, it fits perfectly. If I were to give the music one critique, it's that being discordant in places makes it stand out a bit more than background music technically is supposed to, but I think that goes back to its horror roots, and there's often times when a horror movie soundtrack does similar things to simply unnerve the viewer. Just like the music, the sound and effects in the game are of great quality, which is somewhat unusual, at least based on what I've seen so far on Zilog and Moto. With these games, if a title features any effort at all on the audio side, either the music will be solid, or there'll be an emphasis on sound effects, particularly when it comes to digital speech, but not both. I think that more than likely on the Genesis, that comes down to a space issue with the FM synths, but somehow with Chakan, the developers were able to focus on both, making Chakan a delightfully eerie game to listen to. At least when you're not dying over and over and over. Chakan is a hugely frustrating title for me, even more so than Who Shot Johnny Rock from last month. Who Shot Johnny Rock, being a full motion video based light gun shooter, was always going to have a ceiling of just how good it could be, even if it was implemented correctly. But what about Chakan, with it being a totally original platformer with dark fantasy themes, in an era where you really didn't see that outside of Castlevania? Well, if it wasn't so stupidly difficult and tightened up the control just a bit, and maybe added a method to save your progress, it could have been an all-timer, and maybe that sequel that was developed for the Dreamcast would have actually seen the light of day. But as is, only those that enjoy difficult games, or are perhaps willing to abuse some save states on an emulated platform, need apply. As a result, I'm giving Chakan 2 stars on merit alone, as it is an impressive looking and sounding game with an original design, but I've got to be honest, I ultimately found it frustrating and joyless. If hard games are your thing, I would bump that to 3, but everyone else should probably avoid this one to preserve your controllers.
Okay, that was Chakan for this year's specially picked Halloween episode. I was hopeful when I popped this one in this week, and I thought it would be a nice return to the Genesis after spending 3 weeks with the Master System, but it just wasn't meant to be. Ghouls and Ghosts, Chakan is not. Unfortunately for creator Robert Krause, Chakan appears to be a bit of a sliding doors moment for the franchise, if you can call it that. And if Chakan had been a better game, maybe we'd all be more familiar with the character these days, due to more entries in the series, follow-up comic books, and maybe even some notice from Hollywood. But as it is, Chakan has been banished to the dimension of forgotten superheroes and intellectual property. I'm unfortunately going to need a whole lot of Reese's or Kit Kats to get the taste of Chakan out of my mouth. Let's see what I got here. Oh, great. I'll enjoy. Time to start that diet before Thanksgiving, I suppose. Tune in next week as it's sequel time again on Zilog and Moto. It's actually another fantasy action platformer on the Genesis, but this one has an arcade heritage to it, and I kind of enjoyed the first game in the series, so I'm hopeful that this game will be even better. Although, after playing Chakan this week, if the game doesn't have me rolling my eyes due to yet another annoying death, that's going to be a win for me. Fingers crossed. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 74. If you liked what you saw here and you want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later. What? You didn't think I'd eat it?